debater William Wack. We will now go on to the second panel of the day, which will cover the following theme: the future of Brazilian industry. This will be moderated by journalist Guto Abranches. I would like to call upon Mr. Abranches to the front, and a round of applause for him, please.
Custos, crescimento, expansão, planejamento, oportunidades.
O que está acontecendo com a indústria no Brasil e no mundo? Quais os desafios e oportunidades para a indústria brasileira? Onde estão as...
The interpreters have no sound input in the English booth at this point. We will resume interpretation as soon as the live speakers have the floor again. Thank you.
Very well. It's now time for us to form our panel. I would like to call up to the head of the auditorium, Luciano Coutinho, the president of the BNDES, Jorge, Costa, president of INPI, Rafael, Lucchesi, director of education and technology of ENAI, Bento, Massahico, Koike, president of teve, Rui Chamas, executive vice president of the Braskem Basic Petrochemicals Unit, and João Fernando Gomes Oliveira, president of the Factory of the Millennium Innovation Agency. And the dynamics of this debate will be the same as we had this morning, presented by William Wack in the previous debate, and we hope to have your participation in the choice of questions that will be put on our screen at 3 different moments during the debate. So let us begin with journalist Guto Abranches. Thank you very much, Rosanna. Ladies and gentlemen, and a very good afternoon, and hello to our speakers, myself. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be participating once again in the National Meeting of Industry. And this is an opportunity that we have, that a journalist has the opportunity to go to his roots, to where his training lies, with the people who really know about the issue. So I thank you very much for your trust and for the invitation. I reiterate the invitation made by Rosanna. You know how to vote on the questions that are raised, and I count upon your assistance to have a dynamic, productive conversation of great interest to all. Professor Luciano Coutinho has a commitment. He was called to a meeting of great importance, obviously, but he'll be with us initially, and I'm going to exploit him to the max. And I hope to count upon the collaboration of other participants to do the best of it. Speaking about the future of Brazilian industry, as many agents of the economy, all those present here, in the conversations, the more laid-back ones, have raised the following question. The formulation of these questions, is it correct? How are we going to indicate the profile of Brazilian industry at a time when so many significant members of our industry are speaking of a situation of deindustrialization? Or to put the question another way, perhaps the question should be, is there a future? Is there any way out for Brazilian industry? Professor Coutinho. Guto, firstly, I would like to greet the CNI and all the participants at this, apologizing in advance that I will have to leave in 20 minutes, because Minister Guido Mantica and myself will be announcing the new PSI. As our president announced this morning, and for this reason I have to go. I would also like to greet my colleagues on this panel. And I would like to register how fascinating the presentation made by Paul Macklin. And we have this tremendous challenge before us, how to build paths for rebuilding Brazilian industry. I think we have to take concrete initiatives, improvements in the situation of exchange, reducing interest rates and the cost of capital, a significant effort that has been made to enhance the qualifications of workers, the excellent joint initiative with CNI, this huge training program of the Senai system and the establishment of new laboratories. Aside from this, the attack upon various costs, systemic costs, the cost of electric power, and other logistical costs that will have to be dealt with through a huge cycle of investment that will make the economy as a whole more efficient. These are of a systemic nature, but we're going to have to work hard to create the conditions. Firstly, on the one hand, to enable the recovery of various segments of Brazilian industry, which were squashed by unfavorable costs and pressures of tremendously cutthroat international competition, and to face up to an agenda for competitivity, an agenda that I believe was discussed here, a key agenda. And to this competitivity agenda, add the agenda for innovation that we need badly to leverage. And I see various opportunities for transforming and creating within the tissues of Brazilian industry ways of moving towards new industry. I see this in various different complexes. I'm going to mention a few very briefly so as to name them. We could create a new chain for inputs for the oil and gas sector, where costs have tremendous weight. In the area of energies, some of which are considered very important, especially starting with biofuels and the new generation ethanol. In the health sector of Brazil, we have great opportunities to develop new routes for combined synthesis with biotechnology. We have a complex, an aerospace and defense one that has a leading company and that is capable of developing a much stronger local base. In the area of energies, and looking here at Bento, I remember the equipment for wind energy, for example, and we have a living testimony of how a small Brazilian company is a worldwide leader in one small component of wind energies. And I also mention the information and communication technology complex. I don't want to be even more all-embracing, but we must work on new technologies to stimulate this without forgetting the agenda for competitivity, to have an agenda of incentives and support for innovative processes. I would like to move on to Dr. Rui Chamas. We heard Professor Luis Caetano speaking on behalf of the government and the BNDES. Do you feel more comfortable having heard what he had to say? The discourse of Luciano is very clear, very direct. It makes me feel calmer from seeing that many things have been done from a structural standpoint. Many things still need to be done. But we should acknowledge what has been done. I missed when he ranked the industries, or listed them, the chemical industry. When you spoke first of oil, I understand that Brazil is a country that is rich in oil and gas resources, and that Brazil will certainly be a large-scale producer and exporter of oil and gas. But at the moment, Brazil is a great importer of chemical products. We have a deficit of some $28 billion of imported chemical products. In a country with 200 million population as President, one of the great competitive advantages of Brazil is our internal market. It's growing with a middle class that wants to work and wants to consume, as the President said. We know that we have oil and gas resources, a population that wants to consume increasingly and in all of the areas. Plastics and chemical products are among these, and we must develop a bridge between the oil and gas industry and these finished products to have a chain that leads all the way through the system, so that Brazil ceases to be an importer of chemical products and becomes an exporter of manufactured goods, bringing wealth to this country that we have done. So I did feel more comfortable, but I felt there was a lack of this important component that I imagine is not too far from the heart and mind of Mr. Coutinho. Let us continue with this debate. After Mr. Coutinho leaves us, but I'm going to go back to Mr. Luciano Lucchesi now, and then go back to Mr. Coutinho. What do you think, Dr. Rafael? Is what is being done sufficient, or is there something missing from your standpoint? Essentially, it's a well-established argument. Perhaps, Luciano, some of the agendas based upon demand we could add in this scenario all this question of civil construction, textiles and garments, even though they come up against questions of scale and cost of labor and of inputs in China. But in the garment industry, for example, there is an important role in an entire chain of workers who involve in this that could be modernized and concentrate on certain niches. It's important to stress that we have had improvements in interest rates, exchange rates, labor, qualifications, etc. But the international crisis has wiped out many of these advantages. And so it has made our homework, the homework of the policymakers, much more challenging, because new efforts are needed to achieve relative competitivity and the differences between Brazil and China. And we must continue to pursue our goals as have been debated here. Improvements have been made, but we still need to advance. Just to give you one datum, an important one. In the past 8 years, in relation to the cost of labor in dollars, the average labor cost in dollars, Brazil has risen from $3.10 to $10.10. Between 2002 and 2010, Mexico from 5.6 to 6.2, and from China from 60 cents to $1.40, whereas China had an 80% increase and Mexico a 60 cents. Brazil had an increase of $7, a 227%, much greater than the 11% the dollar value in Mexico, or the 43% of the dollar value for China. So in activities of this sort, it's normal that there should be an overflow of investment and their international strategies in the petrochemical area, for example, to get their raw material in Mexico, which is a third or a quarter of the cost that is in Brazil, and with much lower labor costs. So it is important that we continue to move forward. It's a continuous struggle, and to concentrate on certain sectors which are significant in the older, more traditional industries, where there is an opportunity to reconfigure and achieve modernization. It is for these reasons and others that in 2012 Brazil responded for practically 8% of the value-added values of manufacturing in the world. 2009 this had fallen to 5.4%. The country in 2009 responded for 3.6% of manufactured of this, and in 2009 this indicator went down to 3.49%. Professor, you're not going to leave until I've heard your complaints. But I've heard your complaints. I know that your time is run out. Guto. There's always that danger when you enumerate something. I mentioned here the innovation-intensive and knowledge-intensive sectors. I did not intend to leave aside in the competitive agenda all those complexes that Brazil has built and which lost space which they need to recover. Petrochemicals and the chemical industry in Brazil, I think it is essential that we should preserve it because we have a great future opportunity with raw materials that will come in the future, and we must look to and seek to preserve the we have a significant tax burden that we're working on here. So I am in agreement. The various labor-intensive sectors in Brazil, and as mentioned here by Lucchesi, the textile and garment industry, this is an extremely important chain because it has a significant impact from the regional standpoint and on jobs, and has been squeezed on the cost side. The government has struggled and returned part of the taxation that goes on billings and on payroll, and this has been important for the garment industry. Nonetheless, we have a great challenge before us, which is to increase productivity, etc. Other significant production lanes. Brazilian agribusiness. We should also mention other chains that are based upon raw material, on wood, pulp, paper. Those that supply the construction industry. So there is a great task to improve the competitive capacities so that we do not lose space or allow industry to wane in this structure. Because Brazil's structure is modern, urban, complex, and it needs to have a minimum of diversity in order to be able to transform itself into a sustainably rich society capable of generating high-quality jobs. And industry is the supplier of jobs in services. And today, increasingly, industry mixed with services, as Paul's presentation stressed. Services are part of pre- and post-manufacturing services are a key element for advances of manufacturing. The paradigms have changed, and we need to look at this agenda. Thus, I am fully aware of this, and I do believe that we have a challenge before us that I failed to mention, but I have to mention now. Labor becomes increasingly scarce in Brazil because of a very swift change in the demographic structures. So we have pressures on wages, and the only possible response to this is a strong agenda for encouraging productivity. The CNI has presented a very strong agenda in terms of labor, but this agenda can only be achieved with great increases in labor productivity, which on the one hand require training and qualification of a new light, training for workers, and on the other, acceleration, both in the large companies and right down to the smallest companies, the adoption of digitalized management, which leads to greater automation in various segments. If we are not capable of stimulating gains, greater and more persistent productivity gains for industry, our competitivity challenge will be seriously hampered. So this is my view. Guto, I'm sorry, I really must go, and I apologize to the public, but it comes with the job. I have to go. I would like to stay here. The previous presentation whetted my curiosity, and I'm sorry I won't be able to stay any longer. Having heard your remarks, and if there are remarks, you will be informed. Thank you very much, Mr. Coutinho, President of the BNDES. Let's continue. I would like to call you to the first vote of our first block of questions, and you can decide which questions you want responded. There have been certain hooks that we can use for these. The first possibility for this first phase of questions that were chosen. Alternative aid. For Brazil to be a global actor in competitiveness, it's important to have diversified industry, or should we stimulate specialization in sectors? This was already been dealt with in our speech. The size of the Brazilian market, is it sufficient to generate production scales that are sufficient and to have productivity gains that will make domestic industry competitive, or are going to have greater insertion in the worldwide market? Or will it be possible for Brazil to use its supply of raw materials and at the same time maintain this? Is there a dilemma between manufacturing and extractive industries? You can vote which of these questions is of greatest interest. So when we speak of competitiveness and competitive edges, I think we're speaking about innovation, which is one of the points that will be dealt with here. Intellectual property. So the winner was Alternative C. Is it possible for Brazil to take advantage of its natural resources and at the same time maintain diversified and competitive industry? Is there a dilemma between manufacturing and agriculture and natural resources? I take advantage of the presence of Dr. Bento Massahico. If I have pronounced his name wrong, he is presiding Texas, and he is in the field of clean energy. So I would like to hear his views on this question and then to hear the other speakers. Well, good afternoon. In my view, firstly, you must stimulate the greatest number of initiatives, and this will be based upon the vocations that you have. Brazil has incredible natural resources. We have well-established industries, and based upon what arises in this market, you must take advantage of the vocations and use these. You have natural resources, you have agriculture, you have fertile areas, you have chemicals. You can have a chemical industry based upon ethanol, something that Braskem is doing today. You have great wind, and you have aerospace industry, and you create an industry to use these great winds. I don't know if anybody knows that these are perhaps the best wind resources in the world. and use a technological basis that was created in São José do Campos to generate an industry. In our case at Texis, we are recognized worldwide. We're a leader in the United States. We have more than 50% of market share based upon the knowledge that we have, and we're going to bring this together with our natural resources in Brazil in order to have even greater expansion of our company. Thus, from what I understand, to use diversity in Brazil and to take all the competitive advantages that stem from it. In other words, it's possible to extract, it's possible to manufacture, and it's possible to use biodiversity and sustainableness. Nobody is going to take over the space that belongs to anybody else. It seems a difficult jigsaw puzzle to put together. The theme that we are attempting to do today, to see where to delimit the areas in which we are best. It's going to depend upon the vocations that are revealed, and you have to have a basis that takes care of the vocations that emerge or the ventures that come out so that they can grow and have sufficient scale. But I am very wary of naming sectors that we can define as being the ones that we should concentrate on. So the idea would be, if we have all these natural advantages, we have the resources, etc., how can we best take advantage of these advantages and without becoming or falling into the temptation of becoming mere exporters of commodities? I would like to make a remark. I had the pleasure of meeting the president of Texis and the excellent work that he's carrying out. But at the same time, going back to the theme of this block that has to do with competitiveness and the agriculture and the conflict between sectors, I perceive that in the definition of an agenda, we must seek competitiveness, which has to do with price and the market, and price has to do with costs. And the lack of cost, Rafael has spoken already about labor costs, which have to do with productivity, among others. Tax, but a very perverse and inverted logic that we perceive in Brazil, that despite the fact that we are a country rich in natural resources, there is an inversion of values, or an inversion of gains along the value-added chain for the product. Let me explain. We have a list. I made a note this morning of all the ill-fits, lack of this, inadequate this, competition with China, high spreads, interest rates, all of these things hamper our work. But Petrobras is doing fine, Vale is doing very well, Gerdau's doing all right. Why then do we have these difficulties? Why is our competitiveness bad if we are adding value to the product? Why? Because our labor is expensive and our competitiveness is... But that's not all. I think that the microphone is too loud. What we have observed recently is the following. Our raw materials are a cost component. They're exceptionally expensive. I had two interesting examples. I visited a musical instrument factory that was concerned it might have to close because of the price that a saxophone comes into Brazil. They're able to buy the brass. The saxophone comes from China, and the declared value is the price of the brass plate in here. So people say, oh, look at China. And I say, look, the price of brass in Brazil is too high. So we must see that the primary sectors of industry are doing fine because our raw material costs are absurdly high. The value of gas in Texas is 3 times lower than in Brazil. Energy in Texas is 3 times cheaper than in Brazil. Setting up a chemical industry in China, in Texas, you have less than 1/3 of the costs that you do in Brazil. And there's a question of productivity. So our problem of competitiveness that today curtails our agenda, and despite the things that we have, but our highest costs are of the raw materials. We extract this, we take out the ore, it's expensive, the steel is expensive. Who takes it out? Who takes it out? Those who make the raw material. So when we identify the raw material and produce, you see that the margin gets smaller and smaller because you're comparing to the cost of the imported one, and the raw materials abroad are much cheaper. So my colleague here from Texas, just to finish this story, he told the story of a company that preferred to buy raw material outside of Brazil, Brazilian exported raw material, pre-work it, and then import the raw material because it would be cheaper to work here in Brazil. So this is a significant component. There's no conflict between natural resources and agriculture. What we do have is an imbalance between the markup in the value chain. So you will allow me to speak in a little while about these different sectors, if you should do the incentive for one sector or another, as Dr. Rafael mentioned, and Dr. Chamas também. But I think Dr. Jorge would like to make a remark.
Yes, just a brief remark about this, portion of questions which I think is pretty much interconnected. There's one driving question, but I think the other two questions are very focused questions. Like Professor Coutinho, I too believe that we are in a large country, the economy of which is very complex. And of course, diversification of the Brazilian economy is an opportunity and a comparative advantage for us. So I see no reason whatsoever for us not to tap into that, diversity as an advantage for us. Which means, of course, that there is the risk of the Dutch disease. Yes, indeed. There's also a concern about, especially considering the recent pre-salt layer oil deposits or oil reserves, there is the risk of, the country being out-flooded or flooded out with, foreign exchange. That has been properly managed by the government, I believe. There is a keen concern, that was mentioned by the President earlier in the morning. There is a keen concern in ensuring that this, localized inflow of resources or revenues be properly invested. And I think we're really talking about the opportunity of ultimately having the resources that are required for us to tackle and address a number of... Can't you hear me? Can't you hear me? Apparently some people cannot hear the speaker. The technicians will try to remedy that problem. I think the technical staff need to do something about it. People from the middle of the auditorium to the back can't hear me. Can you still hear me? Can you all hear me? Asks the speaker. Apparently yes now. Good. So let us try to improve the sound as our discussants voice their views. Yes, please try to go ahead. Okay, yes, of course. Well, it seems to me that the opportunity that we now have, given the recent pre-salt layer oil discoveries, as well as the countless advantages we have in natural resource and the successful agribusiness sector, may in turn pose opportunities for us to correct or remedy a number of structural problems that were mentioned here in the course of the day, which of course require high costs for correction. There are, for example, problems and clashes between different states of the Federation. There's a whole array of different issues that have to be addressed if we are serious about taking that step ahead or one step forward. I also think that we can intelligently and positively tap into the synergies that are there among the several different possibilities for industrial development in Brazil. Just one final comment regarding specialization. It seems to me that we are going through a transition period in that we came from a highly autarchical economy where we had, to a large extent, different stages in one same production chain within the national territory. I mean, people's imaginary was that we were able to organize that pro-development policy by interlinking different production activities within the Brazilian territory, given the apparent need to think our development needs in light of a more global and integrated approach. That, I think, will require a selective form of specialization in each line of business or walk of life. I do not see in the future, for example, anyone making choices or choosing one activity. Very likely, within each global chain, players will, take on specific positions. I think that is the ultimate fate and, say, natural destiny of every nation, and I hope that given the assistance the government has given to foster innovation and boost the ability to generate value locally in the Brazilian territory, we will be able, I hope, to position ourselves in the segments that will add more value and prove to be the highest return segments in the overall production chain globally. I'll give you the floor in a few minutes, but I'd like to hear Dr. Rui's remarks on the following point. Much has been said about sectoralization or sector-specific approaches and more or less attention to certain sectors, but discussants have also talked about the possibility of tapping into synergies between and or among sectors, as well as the convergence to foster economic growth as a whole. Do you think that is possible? Well, I think Brazil's greatest benefit is the fact that we have a complex and sophisticated industrial fabric, which is quite certainly a major advantage when it comes to meeting the needs of the domestic market. Now, it is important to bear in mind, and just a few minutes ago someone talked about the pre-salt layer oil discoveries. And I think it is important that in certain segments Brazil may have, industries or, say, industrial chains that are world champions, top-notch chains. And it is important for the government to bear or to keep an eye open to those, not to the detriment of any other segments, but anyway, I think cross-cutting measures can therefore be made, especially for those segments where Brazil can indeed be a global champion, or at least one of the global champions. I think it is absolutely essential that there be a clear-cut, crystal-clear industrial policy in place, whereby we are able to know keenly and clearly what our vision of a future is and where we want to get to. I think the Bigger Brazil plan has the merit of launching that discussion and issue and placing it on the agenda. A number of questions and discussions were held, especially through the so-called competitiveness councils, through which measures have been proposed and put forth. Some have been adopted, but much has been or can still be made for us to further consolidate the industrial policy, so that in those segments where Brazil can naturally be a global highlight, Brazil will do so by fulfilling its natural vocation as a nation. Well, do you think our domestic market exhausts the need for, say, rescuing the industry, or do we need a greater positioning in the planet's economy to actually rescue and rehabilitate the Brazilian domestic industry? I'd like to hear your view before giving the floor to the others, because I want to hear them talk about originality, innovation, and competitive differentials. Well, the topic in your question leads me to the concept of what our specialization is. For example, our specialization in commodities, an area in which we have a pretty good international competitive positioning. Can that expertise, say, cross boundaries into new sectors? Absolutely yes. For example, in the oil and gas industries, or in the steel industry, for example, or in the bioenergy industry, food, renewable energy industry, for example, those are areas where that cross-cutting pollination can prove to play a very important, an extremely important role, thereby triggering and creating economic dynamism and structuring competitions that will prove to be systems-wide and therefore irradiate into other and new industrial activities. Therefore, juggling or coordinating, orchestrating the engineering efforts and challenges of the pre-salt layered oil discoveries will have an irradiating ripple effect onto a number of other production chains throughout Brazil, and that quite certainly will have a reflection on the industry at large, especially if you consider, for example, the demand logics, the underlying demand logics in the domestic market, as is the case, for example, in the petrochemical market or industry. And the same is true for the aerospace industry and everything that has to do with software and services related to, especially based on e-government programs, new access to services, banking automation, even, of course, producing to the overall aggregate throughput or productivity of the economy as a whole. Also based on government initiatives, the health industry, the pharmaceutical industry, they too, of course, play an extremely important role when it comes to biotech or biotechnology and state-of-the-art initiatives. The defense arena is also predicated on government initiatives because it brings together not only the aerospace industry but also the expertise available from other relevant sectors of industrial activity. You should never, of course, bear in mind, or you should never, of course, lose sight of the fact that much of the industrial growth is related to family consumption patterns and economic recovery. And that brings our attention to three key industrial lines of business. The food industry, which of course is a pretty good tradable but can also add value, and also civil construction and also the textile chain, including the apparel industry. I think, or the clothes industry. Those three, I think, can be described as being structuring industries or sectors for the sustainable development of the Brazilian economy into the future. And these are quite certainly industries that will perform an important role in terms of overcoming the competitiveness challenges on the table. And one should always, of course, keep an eye open to the importing ratio into the domestic market. The import ratio has doubled from 1996 all the way up to 2012. It went from 10% in the past all the way up to 20%. In certain industries, such as, for example, the textile industry, it went from about 9% or so all the way up to close to 24%, more than twice as much. So you have to keep an eye open to how to properly manage these tools. The Brazilian industry has paid a pretty high price for, stabilization or for stability. The time has now come for us to establish an equality relationship between macro policy and industrial policy. The industrial policy has to have the same status in the government or in the eyes of the government as macroeconomic policy. Otherwise, we will not be able to overcome or even face up to Chinese competition, as well as the increasingly harder international competition following 2008, given the challenges that lie ahead for all of the broader way of companies that will ultimately structure and solidify the future of our international positioning. Thank you very much. Now, Dr. João, talking about the positioning of Brazilian industry abroad, how do you imagine, or what do you think will be the future of our industry in terms of its relation with the remainder of the world? I mean, bearing in mind some kind of, say, future foreseeable time horizon as opposed to just an infinite time horizon. Do you think innovation is the way to go? And if so, how do you put it into practice? I mean, from Brazil to the world, how do you, say, position the Brazil brand, which has had so much of a hard time in positioning itself internationally? I think the example that was given earlier, I mean, that of Apple and Foxconn, has ultimately become the very iconic or emblematic example given Apple's development and evolution, where Apple is the technology host and Foxconn is the manufacturing party. To develop the industry doesn't really mean that you have to produce locally. That's one of the most, say, immediate and obvious conclusions you come to. Brazil's international positioning, will it be marked by our role as purchasers, or will it rather be marked by our role as innovators? So any effort or attempt at positioning has to bear in mind to what extent one's innovation is pioneering and is doing away with present or past concepts in such a way as to ensure that it will ultimately master and hold in itself the concept and design core of a new product. Even if the actual manufacturing of that product proves to be more effective in China, the company will still be competitive if manufactures in China, as the case of Apple and Foxconn, for example. Now, the one challenge I see in the long term, and that is a source of difficulty, is that, of course, as regards the price makeup or the price compensation, we've talked about human capital, human resources, raw materials, etc., taxes, and we can't possibly change the tax component unless the economy grows very fast and the government remains with its costs unchanged. The different spheres of Brazilian government plus taxes add for about 20% or 35% of the GDP. In China, they add up to 20% of the GDP. So if you work out the math and see how much companies will have to pay in terms of payroll taxes and taxes, or rather taxes levied over turnover plus PIS and COFINS and all kinds of products, it all adds up to 45% in Brazil. That's the cost of doing business here. However, if you think about the future, you have to think about companies that are born today but want to survive into the future. I have a pretty good example of companies that benefit from the so-called simplified tax scheme. The overall tax burden is about 12%. If you're close to 3,000 or 3,600 Brazilian reals, you no longer benefit from that tax scheme if you earn more. So in a given year, the entrepreneur could benefit from the streamlined or simplified tax scheme. Now, 35% in terms of tax burden is pretty good. Now, if you went to bed today and tomorrow you woke up with a higher turnover, that means your tax burden will be about 45% next year. In other words, the more you sell, the more or the higher the tax burden. So that means the end of your profit margin, because everything that could possibly be a profit margin has become taxes. So business people end up stopping at that point in time and asking themselves the question, what do I do now? I think Robinson said, well, you can go ahead and open up a new one. You can go ahead and work with two companies. That would be illegal, because opening up a second company would be tantamount to tax evasion. But there's a good solution. I mean, move to Shenzhen, take the Shenzhen example. You get to Shenzhen and you say, hey, this is my product. Would you be willing to manufacture it to me and send it back to me fully assembled as an end product? I mean, when you got the cost estimate, I mean, for an electric or consumer electronic product to be set up or assembled in Brazil will cost, number one, the prices of components. That means that all of your production people can be fired. That's illegal. You cannot really open up a new company for tax evasion. So you can bring your product ready-made and fully assembled from China. You start selling it in Brazil, and your margin will go back to 25% as far as profit margin is concerned, which would be your labor cost in a company like that, which is very much at the threshold between the two tax brackets. So ultimately speaking, there are certain sectors where we will not prove competitive, but these sectors may prove extremely important. I mean, sectors Rafael so aptly indicated, where we have or stand greater a chance. So if the family has an income flow, in addition to buying textiles and food, they will also need to buy manufactured goods. And we will, of course, need to have controls and consumer electronics. And a reasonably diversified industrial base is really key. And, of course, training is key and essential here. That is a major challenge for us, in my view. I mean, the challenge of lowering the tax burden that currently applies in Brazil. So in that regard, I think that the future industry, or the industry of the future in Brazil, ends up ultimately, or will ultimately prove to be highly concentrated in areas such as those mentioned by Professor Luciano, and which were later discussed by Rafael, plus of course the chemical industry. Moreover, I also envisage that our innovation opportunity consists in working proactively and being more innovative in terms of product design and manufacturing, so that with state-of-the-art manufacturing techniques we saw earlier today, we can prove again competitive in those sectors of industrial activity where we are no longer competitive. Thank you.
Com relação a esse tema da inovação.
Regarding innovation, once again, I just thought I'd make a few brief remarks based on my first-hand experience, the experience we ourselves have this year. Like everyone else in the market, or in the industry, we have seen an increase in labor costs. Ours is a very labor-intensive product, and 2012 was a pretty good year for us. And I say this based on a process we developed focusing on our customers, an innovation-based process. We sold to our main customer that about 1.5 years ago, we sold process development for the use of carbon fibers in wind energy facilities, or wind energy farms. We sold that based on Brazilian engineering and expertise, and we designed a fully developed process for our customers. In 6 months, the product was already being tested in California. It successfully proved to be a product that was very much in line with demand in the United States. And this year, in 2012, because of that product we designed and developed based on our Brazilian technology from scratch, that product ended up accounting for about 10% of the world's carbon production for that specific production line alone. So what I think the solution is here to overcome a number of the current bottlenecks or hurdles ultimately lies, in my view, in developing, as we have done in Texas, in developing one's and fostering one's ability for innovation, and also designing and building technological innovations that will in turn allow you to overcome any shortcomings you may still have in terms of structure in Brazil, such as, for example, the whole issues regarding increasing costs and related implications. It's just too bad, really, that the wages which we have seen have proved a little higher. Unfortunately, a very small amount of the wages are actually, net wages available to wage earners. Much of the wages are actually used to pay taxes. Right, we have seen, of course, different rounds of discussions regarding the tax reform, and it is not likely to happen in the foreseeable future. I'd now like to invite you to again vote in a new voting round. We've talked about innovation, originality, and good ideas. We have also talked about international positioning. Can one thing be detrimental to the other? Or can, say, the specific Brazilian legislation in terms of product registration or brand registration, can that be a hurdle? And should it perhaps be revisited, not so as to remove any existing barriers? Well, I honestly think that's not the case, because in virtually every sector, I think the Brazilian, say, legal framework is pretty modern, except for a few exceptions here and there. There are areas where we need to, of course, benefit from greater enhancements to have in place a legal framework that will prove to be more in line with that of developed countries. I mean, a case in point is biotechnology, where I think there is a clear-cut need for greater improvements. Now, I think we have, however, a much bigger challenge before us. I'm talking about the need to build a real pro-innovation culture and a better understanding, both on the part of the government and on the part of the business community and business leaders. A clear-cut understanding has to be fostered to cast light on how the manufacturing process takes place, as well as how the trading process takes place in the so-called globalized knowledge economy. What I see is that the filing of patents by Brazilians or the creation of brands by Brazilians is way below the current potentialities, given the size and the sheer magnitude of our economy, and of course the potentialities therein. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, take China, for example. In 2012, more than 1 million patents will be registered or filed for. People may hear these figures and say, well, yeah, but the quality of those patents in China is pretty rudimental or precarious, isn't it? Well, quality of patents is a very sophisticated issue to discuss, but I think it would be light-minded and irresponsible to say that the quality of Chinese patents is that rudimental or precarious. In many parts of the world, many patents will never ever be used, will probably die out in the process for many reasons, but the remaining patents that do take off, of course, is more than enough to pay for the efforts of creating and filing that many patents. In this year, Brazilians will be able to develop about 15,000 patents altogether, a very low number by comparison. It ultimately means that we are not really changing intellectual work of Brazilians into actual market value. It also means that we have failed to understand that in the knowledge economy, knowledge is a product. It is an asset which, if properly protected and established, becomes part and parcel of the trade chains. It becomes part and parcel of the exports world, and obviously enough, it becomes the most expensive, most valuable component in a value chain of any product, or even in an industrial segment. So when we talk about seeking to properly position ourselves in the several different production chains, and do so by adding or highly adding value to the chain, that ultimately means that we should find ways and means to take part in and benefit from that asset or the highest value component in the production chain. I'm talking about IP, or intellectual property, knowledge in other words. And that of course requires that culture be developed in order to better understand how knowledge is developed. I mean, Brazilians do apply knowledge in manufacturing processes. We also apply knowledge to a great deal in our everyday production activities. I mean, we have state-of-the-art, excellent engineers, yes we do, but we have not yet developed the culture to condition the development of technologies and designs and innovative, groundbreaking solutions and proposals into something that will truly lead to premium pricing and royalties to be paid as a result. In other words, the kind of benefit or advantage that would more actively and dynamically position ourselves in the highest value production chains at the international global level. So what you're saying is that on the one hand, the Brazilian industry ultimately loses space in the most traditional sectors, and in parallel it has failed to gain room or gain territory in other sectors where, from an innovation or international innovation perspective, could possibly lead to great advantages. Is that what you're saying? Well, I wouldn't like to sound so pessimistic. I think we're actually in a transition process. Well, I don't mean to be pessimistic either. Yeah, but I think there's a very robust partnership between business leaders and the government. I think May is the best example thereof. And I think in the past 2.5 years, ever since May was established, much progress has been made. And the progress made in the recent past in terms of discussions and mutual understanding among different players has been pretty substantial. I mean, we're really talking about a different level of international positioning. For quite some time in this country, we had the kind of industry that was only geared towards producing for the domestic market with mature, not innovative technologies. Now, if you want to competitively take part in the international market, you have to have an industry that is geared towards the foreign market, and one that is capable of, putting forth innovative solutions and technologies. So, I mean, the arrows have to be changed. But of course, you can't invert the arrows 100% all of a sudden, because no single company will be the producer of all of the technology that it can use. But if you are able to innovate and put forth important technologies into the market, you will then have access to all of the relevant technology that will therefore benefit from much higher yield levels in production volumes. Thank you very much. That's what we call value added. I'd like to ask our technical staff whether we are in a position to go for yet another round of votes, because given the recent discussions, I'd now like to move on to the third as opposed to the second block of questions, because I think it very much fits in more properly. Can we have the third block of questions as opposed to the second line or block of questions, if at all possible? Because I think it has everything to do with what we just covered. I think it will be a very natural continuation of what we are talking about here. If that's not possible, not a problem. We'll go back to it later with a third block of questions. All right, good. We have the third block of questions now. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I know I've pretty much disturbed your work routine, but of course, don't take me wrong for that. Now, the second round of voting. Our next voting round will try to address the following aspects, which we have just covered. First, alternative. Are Brazilian technology institutes in a position to assist companies in their needs for technologically related support? Question B, has Brazil lost territory in traditional conventional areas? Yes, as I mentioned, but that is probably related to labor costs, true. But at the same time, Brazil has not shown any success in gaining territory in innovation-intensive sectors. The question is, what can one possibly do to change that state of affairs? Alternative C, what can one possibly do to ensure that the Brazilian industry will benefit from new world trends in the manufacturing processes as regards digitization, new materials, robotics, and so forth, trends that which so very properly and aptly explained during Mr. Paul MacLeay's presentation a few minutes ago. So you're free to vote now. You have 15 minutes. The interpreters would like to remind you that interpretation will be available for another 15 minutes as agreed with the organizers. Technically until 5 o'clock, but we will go ahead for another 15 or 10 minutes.
So this is the question. Brazil has lost space in traditional industrial production and has not advanced in terms of innovation. What can be done to change this situation? We begin with Dr. João Fernando of the Millennium Factory Initiative. Do you have any clues? First of all, let us see if the microphones have improved. Dr. Jorge, are you hearing better now? Can you hear? Thank you, Dr. João. Can you all hear me? It appears that they can. I have some experience in this on losing space in traditional fields. It's a very recent experience. Prior to going back to the University of São Paulo and the Millennium Factory, I presided in PT in São Paulo for a number of years. The Institute of Technological Research of the state of São Paulo. And at this institution we had a great investment. So when you're going to do an investment in a center for innovation or research, you have to find out what the best opportunities are to invest in quality, to invest in laboratories, investments in technology and manufacturing, and we made investments in areas where there was greatest demand. At the end of last year, we perceived that certain traditional sectors were not justifying the service at IPT, and we began to analyze how those sectors were going. And in speaking to our researchers, the answer was as follows. Our client is closing. The client who came here and used an electromagnetic to check us, he closed. He had other tests to do, but he closed. These sectors that were no longer responding to the capacity of dealing with research in order to improve their product or innovation was because they were not in an environment that was sufficiently propitious for strengthening. You need land, water, etc. to do this. I do not believe that simply a great injection of innovation is going to help. Innovation is not just throwing sufficient water at the plant. You have to have the earth, you have to have the fertilizers, you have to have the other inputs. So we have these things with around 1,500, which sold 100 million. These are the ones that had greatest chance of innovating, because they were pari passu with these. We're talking about electrical and electronic, traditional areas, advanced areas. In the textile area of textiles, there's a great division between two different types of textiles: electrical, electronic, equipment, appliances, electrical materials. And we had legislation that produced a reduction of tax on payroll and went from payroll to billings, took taxes off those that employed more people from 2011 to the present. But I perceive that innovation on its own doesn't save the traditional sectors that are declining within our economy. You need other actions that enable the entire portion of costs in this segment, make it more competitive at the worldwide level, or else we have to accept that we're going to produce in Shenzhen until such a time as our economy grows, GDP grows, and the fraction taken by government from the productive sector is reduced. Because the difference is going to come from somewhere. People are going to lose money. Reducing tax is not the only factor. I'm going to ask Dr. Rafael to see if these two fronts can work together and to see what the priorities should be. I'm speaking of innovation that makes us think ahead, makes us think of international insertion with competitive gains without losing the basis of our factory floor that we've had for so long. Firstly, and most importantly, if we take the 12 main points of the competitivity agenda of CNI, we perceive that infrastructure is improving, the regulatory framework as well, but the speed is slow and progress is moving forward very slowly. If we take the three factors, exchange rates, interest and tax burden, there have been improvements, but the opportunities for reform are still very limited, and we don't see it moving forward at the speed we need, although the CNI and the whole business sector is going to continue pressing for this. Labor relations involve lots of complexity. The CNI has improved in this event, an extremely important agenda on which we can advance, but also in which we will not have tremendous speed. In other words, we need to continue struggling with the old agenda that Brazil did not do its homework as did the more competitive countries, and to advance quickly with the new agenda. So it's a double task. We have a double agenda. To pursue the old agenda on which we have lost to the developed countries and the best located emergent countries, and to move in fully on the new agenda. In the new agenda we have a double problem with innovation. The companies have a low innovation culture as a consequence of the path of social development in Brazil, and also the past and the recent crisis, and also these things are a long way from so public spending is still very related to applied research, academic papers, and far from all those technologies between the lab and the factory floor. So we have this double problem that we need to correct. What we are advancing with is acceleration of the evolution of the legal framework, the instruments of public policy, among them intellectual property, which the president of INPI mentioned. The PPP is a great example of a public-private partnership to move forward with this agenda. So what do we have in terms of innovation for this? The advent of EMBRAPI, in which you have a fast-track solution, which was a great problem of IPT, of SENAI, of the UNT, and the entire innovation system on which you depended, and the public calls for bids, etc. So EMBRAPI will give greater speed to the need for innovation services for the Brazilian industry. To this we must add what we are doing at SENAI. We are creating 23 SENAI innovation centers and 61 SENAI institutes for technology. This is an inflection in the realities of SENAI, which is today the greatest network of technical and technological services for the Brazilian industry. We have more than 200 laboratories, the greatest network of companies accredited to INEP, with more than 120 procedures, and we are going to advance significantly with this in order to provide support for the need to add value to Brazilian industry. Cross-cutting innovation, such as innovation technology, all the polymers, defense, surface engineering, steel linings, software, biomass, logistics, micro-manufacturing, which has to do with the previous presentation, virtual technologies, everything that has to do with ceramics and biotechnology. It's a set of new types of equipment that will be there to support Brazilian industry throughout Brazilian territory, working as a network. This, allied to the 27 centers for mobilization that INEI will have in each federation of industry, will provide the kind of environment that we had in the Brazilian quality and innovation activity that we had, where we reacted to the shocks of the 1990s in the productivity and quality. So, combining the efforts of science, technology, BNDES, FINEP, MIGIC, etc., SEBRAE, with this effort of SENAI and SENI, is going to give great externalities for support of Brazilian industry, which has in these three typologies the supplies, the great national champions. We have to add value, everything that we can place on the Brazilian domestic market and move forward, especially on this. So I think that this structure will have a very significant role in future. So I would like to correct one point, one correction. I am somewhat pessimistic today. You can have innovation, but if the company doesn't have minimum conditions, nothing can be done. So this set of this, obviously innovation and the acceleration in the marketing, using our academic infrastructure, which is excellent, but which should be based on companies rather than institutes. All of this can bring great surprises for Brazil in relation to our capacity to react. So I sign beneath what he has just said. We at SENAI like to complain of the government. Now the government's left us, of course. They haven't completely left. I don't see any reason why you should be pessimistic. I do not believe in deindustrialization. I think we're going through a moment of transition, changes in levels, changes in standards, and it's a question of what can be done. I've spoken extensively with Rafael, and we have a debt that needs to be, and we have to move forward with this new agenda, but I do not believe that there are any such traditional sectors in that. The entire economy in all sectors are dependent upon high doses of innovation capacity. So I think the great challenge that we have to overcome this situation is indeed to face up to our greatest challenge within the Brasil Maior plan, and to promote, using all the instruments available, increased private investment in research, development, technology and innovation. Just to conclude, it appears to me that these instruments are of a financial nature, the taxation. We have still much to do. We are only beginning to work on this. Instruments of demand that have to be attacked, and the regulatory framework. So if you offer to a private investor adequate risk and return conditions, that he can come in with innovation. So in Brazil, we have to make efforts so that private investors are able to appropriate the value of their innovation with the greatest efficiency possible. We have just had a series of innovations for the NPI to increase the capacity for examination, because the great complaint of the business people in Brazil today is the delay in patents. I received an observation on this. I'm glad you responded to this. Since the president of our NPI is here, we can also complain about him. What I can say is that there's been a very well-made diagnosis of actions of various types, but underway, and the business associations know, CNI does. And the most visible part of this is investment that the federal government has made in expanding the staff of INPI, and what the president recently sent, creating 465 new jobs for patent examiners. So there's no magic step, but we could approve all patents today, even if they're all wrong and all the rest of it. They might be totally inadequate for the national market and the international market. But if in a swift manner, and to do this possibly, we need to invest in the human resources necessary for this task. I'm going to go on to Dr. Rui, and I need you to be very brief, because the third vote is going to take place so we can close our debate. When we speak of competitiveness or innovation, I go back to industrial policy. In the Brasil Maior program, there was the productivity and the chemical and oil and gas. They ranked 3 macro measures that should be the basis for the industrial policy for oil and gas. Unburdening of tax on investment, incentives to investment, and reducing tax on raw materials so that we are able to have productivity or profitability. Innovation, investment, and competitivity. There's no dichotomy. I thank you very much for your very objective response. I now invite you to another vote. And in the second block, the one that we left behind in order to take advantage of the time of our speakers, the third and last vote, your question is there. The alternatives are A. What is the role of the services sector in the future of industry? Is not this secretary very protected from international competition as compared to industry? B. How do you assess the quality of the Brazilian regulatory system and the role of the regulatory agencies? C. Environmental sustainability, is this cost or opportunity? What can we do so that Brazilian industry can benefit from the changes that are being implemented by more demanding consumers worldwide? Just as we vote, I would like to make a commercial for our stand. There's a questionnaire of the INPI, and I would call upon you to respond to this questionnaire so that you can help us to improve our services. We have a result. There it is. Environmental sustainability. Is environmental sustainability a cost or an advantage? And how can Brazil... You brought this up, and you mentioned these more demanding systems. So, with an eye to sustainability and preservation of the planet, these things are changing very quickly. Can our industry accompany these?
Evidentemente, a questão da sustentabilidade.
It's a need. It's not just a question. The planet needs to take measures, otherwise it will come to an end. So its stability is a demand that is being made more incisively in the more developed societies. But I think it's a tremendous opportunity. It creates an entire chain of needs and businesses and opportunities for innovation. So it's a change in the market. It's the opening of a new market, and I believe it is an opportunity so that we as Brazilians can create innovative solutions, develop technologies, and in this way seek a better position in the international context. And in this regard, I would raise one more ingredient for the aspect of innovation. I think it's fundamental that we should develop innovation in Brazil so that our companies can be increasingly exposed to the worldwide market. I think that the companies that are very internal and only react to local circumstances lose an opportunity to face up to competition with the real players worldwide, and with this you lose a bit of the innovation that may create a different aspect. Dr. João, is competitiveness obliging us to be innovative? Sustainability, is it a cost or an opportunity? It depends upon the focus of your sector. For example, Bento, who I had the pleasure of meeting and talking to today, he is an example of a businessman with a very high standard who created a business which has an opportunity and is now involved in international business. And he has gotten around the fiscal problem. So he's one of the greatest exporter in the world of wind generators. So Bento find in this question of sustainability an opportunity. But if we divide the area of the planet and look at the surface of the earth, remove the forests, the deserts, the oceans, etc., all available areas for producing renewables, and divide it by the population of the world, gives us 1.8 hectares per head. Each of us has a little less than 2 city blocks to produce everything we need. The world is now divided into 2.2 hectares per head. And if we have among these, but it's a very large area, we are reducing this space. So the pressure for sustainability will be greater. And this aspect is imposed upon Brazil. We have this vast level of, and this very small eco footprint. But I perceive that even among traditional sectors, or those that are more consolidated, a great opportunity on the part of Brazil to come in with a sustainability agenda with green polymers, renewable resources maintained based upon a well-performed life cycle that convinces consumers that it is more sustainable and is not going to hamper the development of the planet. If you understand this as a cost, then it will be a problem. It has to be understood as a opportunity. Now looking from the standpoint of the industry, how does it hamper? To what extent? One of the rules, it's a necessity. We cannot look at this. There's no industrial development unless it's sustainable. If it's not sustainable, it's not development. But in Brazil we have an advantage. The fact that we have a reserve of renewable resources, or the capability of generating significant renewable resources, this enables us to produce products based upon this vast biomass that we have and offer it to the world market. Braskem has been a pioneer in developing from sugarcane the greatest plant for biopolymers. We are world leaders today. We export to the entire world, and this product is appreciated in view of its physical capacities, but the fact that it absorbs 2,000 tons of CO2 for each 2 tons that we produce. So to produce one, very different to a situation where we have one, for every 1 ton of product, you have 200 tons of this. This puts Brazil in the lead of an industry in which it has very clear competitive advantage, whereby the wave of sustainability has for our country created a fantastic comparative advantage. You have 1 more minute, Dr. Rafael, to make a remark on this theme, sustainability of production. Well, China, 10 years ago, had 19% of the worldwide manufacturing. Today it has 39%. So China...
Custa de enorme passivo ambiental. Nós, no Brasil, temos muito mais ativos do que passivos, o que nos coloca numa posição relativa diferente do ponto de vista de custo de competitividade futura. E isso é um argumento importante. Mas a indústria brasileira, ela tem baixo impacto ambiental. A pegada ambiental da indústria brasileira é muito boa. As tecnologias são ecoeficientes. É uma indústria que fez o dever de casa. O efeito, o impacto da indústria brasileira na emissão de gases de efeito estufa no Brasil é residual. É residual. O agronegócio tem impacto muito maior. Então, quando a gente qualifica essa discussão, nós precisamos qualificar uma discussão num peso do debate que houve aqui hoje de manhã. Há muito mais incerteza jurídica e burocracia na agenda ambiental brasileira do que uma pertinência na alocação dos temas à luz da realidade. Porque você não vai gerar geração de riqueza, incluir segmentos expressivos da população, criar um mercado representativo de bens e serviços com zero de impacto. Isso tem algum impacto, mas é um impacto muito menor pela qualidade.
Lower impact in view of in comparison to other emerging countries, as, for example, China. It's much more worthwhile to do this and leverage Brazilian industry, creating an agenda for sustainable development with social inclusion, with high transformation power, than to derive this for imports from China. So the inclusion agenda must be based upon modern industry, eco-efficient, and this is indeed an opportunity in terms associated to this. Dr. Jorge, I believe that if it's a question of cost or a question of opportunity, it's going to depend on whether we have or do not have, or to identify where this great demand for sustainability exists. I would remind you that to develop innovation, to make things more sustainable, is a profitable business with great potential worldwide, provided that you have a provided that technologies are covered and sold with the best techniques for this. At INPI we have a special line for priorities, for green patents that represent sustainability gains, energy efficiency, and this allows us at this time for us not to face the problems of backwardness and to take full advantage of the opportunities. Well, I thank our speakers in this phase and now call upon my friend Rosana Jatoba, who's going to continue with the work. So we'll come back shortly.
The interpreters would like to inform our listeners that interpretation will be discontinued at this point, as agreed with the organizers, up until 5 o'clock or so. It's now about 5:15, and we thank you very much for your kind attention. We kindly request you to please return the translation receivers and the equipment to the technicians or back to the